Now, with the model's detailing all out of the way, it's now time to talk about the tank's mechanical functions. Of all of the 1/16 scale ready-to-run models that I've done through the years, from Henlong, various generations of Henlong, to Taigen, to even Huben, I must say, of all of them, this Mato tank here, by far, in any way, had the worst electronics I've ever seen or have ever witnessed on one of these models. Now, originally, I had an idea to swap out the electronics and replace them with a system from Elmod. The Elmod system is a very nice system. In fact, I was talking with the one sales rep who has tutorial videos on YouTube. He's a great guy, and he really pointed me in the right direction for the system. However, I decided not to go with it. The reason why I didn't go with the Elmod system was that the Elmod system would have worked on this tank. However, it requires a radio that would have been way overkill for this particular application. Keep in mind, this model here is being built for commission and for a customer. Because of that, simplicity needs to be stressed on all aspects of this model, as well as user feasibility. Having a very advanced radio that has multiple functions, where you can have multiple models on said radio, is very interesting for a collector, but for something like this, it's definitely not really necessary. Instead of using the Elmod, I went ahead and opted for the, at the time, brand new and newly announced Taigen T5 electronic package. This electronic package was very simple to hook up and basically ticked all the boxes for this particular build. The model does feature proportional drive steering, as well as a nice, or I should say a decent sound system with a decent quality speaker, as well as capabilities for not only the standard RC tank stuff, which is that of a turret rotation, gun elevation, as well as also a smoke system and lighting. Also included is that of a machine gun firing capability, and all of which are simple plug-and-play type installation and was very easily configured, ready to go out of the box. The system dropped into the Mato unit, however, it did require a bit of alteration done to the interior fitting. You can see it from the photographs that I have listed below, how much the inside needed to change in order to add all these new functions. Now, what is interesting is that the Mato Tiger did not have any smoke system capabilities whatsoever, nor did it have a flashing bow machine gun. These features were added, and to add this did require to allocate some space on the inside portion of the model. Now, the model smoke system is that of the Henlong unit, as is also the gun elevation, as well as the airsoft firing capability. All three of these units were acquired from AliExpress and were mounted directly to the model. Now, the reason why for the turret functions I went with the Henlong pattern was, again, because the model itself is based off of the Henlong tooling. Because of that, the mounts for the gun system and the elevation system are all present on all of the components, and everything simply just dropped in directly into place. The one place where I did have to make the modification was that to the gun elevation tab found on the airsoft BB gun, as for some reason it had a slight bit of difference needing to be made. Once these tweaks were added, the unit was able to retain its full functional capability, and everything just patched directly in place. Now, one area where this model was definitely a hair puller had to do with that of the turret rotation system. The rotating gearbox, which I have here on the stock unit, the gearbox itself, this is the original unit from the Mato model. It looks like a standard 1/16 scale turret rotation gearbox, and it works the same way. However, it is garbage. This unit here was simply underpowered and couldn't rotate this turret, and it drove me bonkers and up the wall when I was trying to get it to function properly. In addition to the gearbox, I also had to change out that little board that is located on the inside portion of the hull, where you connect the upper hull to the lower hull electronics with that of the umbilical cord. Even that circuit board needed to have been replaced, as it just wasn't working. So it was one of those things where I had to replace the circuit board, and then I have to replace the gearbox. It was a disaster. just about every single bit of electronics inside of this tank, with the exception of the main gearbox, as well as the headlights, all the other electronics, everything else that receives an electronical circuit needed to have been replaced. And to add further frustration to this particular build, during the time I was working on it, there was a huge shortage of all these components, as there was the Chinese New Year going on, and there were delays backed up for months just waiting for simple electronics. And by the time I would get another piece of electronic, I had to order a gearbox or something else, and it was further delays as pieces just weren't coming into the country at this time. The delay was terrible. That was a whole lot of frustration on this model, but I was able to muscle through it without turning this guy into a boat anchor. So, having said that, the tank now runs in its current configuration, where on the outside it's a Mato, however under the hood it's basically a brand new off-the-shelf Taigen. Now I will say one thing that's nice about the new T5 electronics is that you can utilize either the stock radio like I have here, or they have an option where you can keep the electronics and swap out the radio with that for something like a Futaba or a high-tech, something a little bit more hobby grade compared to one of these ready-to-run grade type radios. Again, for this particular build here, the stock Taigen type radio is perfectly suffice, and I'll go over the functions and features that this has in the test drive footage. Other work that's important to point out has to do with the way the two hull halves fit together. This did require a lot of hand fitting compared to the stock original offering. Now, what's unique about the Mato model is that it has a nice system designed for that of separating the two hull halves. Now, to take apart the halves on the Mato, they have this nice little, very slick system in which the latch is discreetly camouflaged as the tank starter plate. This is very different from the Taigen design, which utilizes that little discreet latch, which is found here on the underside of the sponson, and it's very different from the headlong, which has no latch. The tank's upper and lower halves are simply bolted together. On the Mato here, this is done with that of this starter plate, which is spring retained in place and locks in a very secure manner. Now, to get it to work fully did require some hand fitting compared to when the tank was first dropped off, as it was stocked from the factory. Originally, the starter plate was very stiff and the spring was binding on the internal mechanism. Furthermore, the two halves were not locking together in a nice strong way. With a little tug, the whole top would have just popped right off. After the hand fitting is done, that's no longer the case. To get everything working, I first had to remove some material on the inside portion here of the locking lug, which solved the spring binding problem. If you notice, the spring just returns the piece in a nice positive way. Furthermore, the locking lug surfaces on the rear plate and on the front hull need to have been adjusted by having some material removed in order for the two halves to clamp together in the way they were originally designed. On the front section here, with some swipes of a file, I was able to remove just the right amount of material to get this half to fully tongue in properly. Now, another mod I had to do with the actual tongue and groove system that we have here on the front. There are two lugs that are integrally molded to the front and to the upper deck, to which there are these little plates that are bolted to each of these sections, and this is what actually holds and secures the front to the model. The original model utilized that of die-cast aluminum sections, which would be threaded into these locations. Unfortunately, this model here, because the halves weren't fitting right, the die-cast sections were bent and tweaked in order to get the tank to mount in a basic manner. Because of this, these pieces were compromised, and one of them, I believe, was broken when I received the model. This was definitely something that had to have been addressed. The die-cast lugs were completely pitched and removed, and in their place, I replaced them with new pieces fabricated from brass strip. The pieces were then bolted to the same sections as before, with that of Loctite fasteners, and the new sections now with the hand fitting, everything was now in a much more streamlined and efficient manner. Now, unfortunately, I'm not going to take the hull apart, simply because, again, this is an early production Tiger I with the dread FIFO system. When you try to take apart a model like this, You have to first take off the fightful tubes, which will just lead to issues. It's definitely not something you want to do on a regular basis, like I alluded to earlier. Again, when it comes to these Tiger 1s with the fightful system, leave the tank alone. And again, this is why on my builds, I designed these early production Tigers with as much of the interior components as necessary to be accessed from the outside. Again, so that you never have to crack this guy open. This only should be done for emergency case to get access to the gearbox or other electronics. Other than that, the entire tank should serve its life, fully buttoned up in the way you see it here. Before I take it out on a test run, I'm going to go ahead and go over the features found on the radio. Now, like I also said before, the entire tank stock electronics were pitched in favor for the Taigen T5 radio and RC equipment. Now, to turn on the tank, first of course I will turn on the radio. And the power switch is located in the driver section, like what was mentioned earlier on in this video. Once the power is on, it's going to be like your average Taigen tank. You notice that the headlights are blinking, waiting for me to turn on or actuate the tank sound system and unlocking it. To that, that's with this toggle switch over here. With the tank on, I can now go ahead and turn on the smoke system. That's done with this toggle switch. Smoke system takes a little while to heat up, but once it gets going, you will have smoke emitting from the exhaust manifolds. For the bow machine gun, Taigen went ahead and on their current version of the radio, they have it on this little button over here, where if you hit it, you have the little flashing bow machine gun feature. As for drive, that's all single stick control. And this stick here is for that of the turret functions. Left and right, rotate the turret. Down fires the airsoft gun, and holding up elevates and depresses the gun. Now, just like with the other Taigen tanks and the older Henlong pattern, the gun is on a closed circuit and will just run its track, will go up, down, and up again as long as you hold down onto the feature. Unlike the new Henlong units in which to elevate the gun, that's on a separate channel, on this system here, it's your more traditional type layout. As for the rear convoy light, you can see the light in operation now. Now, it's a little tricky to get in frame during the daytime setting. However, the light is fully functional. Now, like I mentioned before, the battery is mounted on the inside portion of the model and is recharged via the external recharge jack. As for the battery itself, this is a aftermarket battery which was procured from Amazon.com. I've used these batteries on all of my 1/16 scale builds and they are highly recommended. The link can be found in the video description, but will take you directly to the item on Amazon's catalog. One final setting to reference is that of the trim control. The trim on this model here has been set and is fully adjusted. However, it's important to point out that if anyone acquires a 1/16 scale tank and they try to drive it and the tank wants to go in one direction or another and does not want to go in a straight line, chances are very likely that your trim is not properly set. On a Henlong tank, the trim is a slider on the bottom portion here of the radio, and on the Taigens, it's that of this rotary knob. To set the trim, you simply drive the tank and adjust accordingly until finally the tank will run in a straight enough line to meet your needs. Once that is completed, the trim has been set and the tank is ready to go. With combination of the low geared gearbox combined with the sheer mass and weight of the entire model being all metal, it should make for a very interesting test drive experience, specifically when dealing with off-road conditions. The tank is currently on. I'm going to fire it up and take it for a test drive. Well, now that the test drive is completed, you could see how well the tank performed on both on and off-road conditions, which, needless to say, was actually pretty well. The tank's runtime was also very good. In fact, the tank's battery has a good charge in it still, and I could actually take it around for more laps if desired. One thing to point out, though, was the rear section here of the mud flaps. During the early test drive footage, I had a recurring issue with dirt and debris puddling up in this section over here. This is standard for Tiger ones as well as King Tigers as well. And when you have a lot of dirt and debris like this add up, it actually lifts up the rear mud flap and can unhinge it from its mount. If it gets unhinged, the mud flap can fall off, and you're going to have a really difficult time trying to track it down and try to re-put it on, specifically if you're driving in some heavy off-road type conditions like the type of terrain that you saw me driving on earlier. If you lose a part in that, it's going to be very difficult to backtrack and try and dig your parts up. Its problem was a really cumbersome and annoying issue, and the way I solved it was I added some hot glue to the bottom portion of the hinges. The hot glue basically sealed everything off, and it doesn't do anything to the tank's finish. However, the pieces are still functional, but are locked in place and will have a lot more of a difficult time in popping out compared to the standard stock original. This is definitely a tip and trick I recommend for anyone who has one of these 1/16 ready-to-run models, albeit either from Taigen or Henlong, or in this case even a Mato. As for the actual running, the tank's weight is definitely appreciated, specifically when handling any sort of terrain. The suspension articulates very well, and with the added weight of the suspension, the turret, and the hull, really give the tank a nice gliding type approach when it comes to maneuvering around rough terrain. It's definitely seen and more appreciated on an all-metal tank like this as opposed to an all-plastic tank. The added weight also helps reduce the speed of the tank, and it contributes to slightly better performance that is noticeable, specifically for anyone who's driven one of the all-plastic tanks. You definitely notice a difference with the handling when leveling up to an all-metal tank like this one here. Now, I did notice in certain type of settings, namely with heavy grass, kind of like with the terrain that I have here, the tank would have a little bit of difficulty trying to turn with a single track under its own power, and you would have to resort to either a dual track rotate or even a neutral steer in order to get the tank to really have enough power to overcome the type of setting that I was driving on. Now, this is something for anyone who's operating one of these models to be aware of. If you are driving and you notice a bog down or the tank's starting to strain a little bit when trying to overcome certain obstacles, specifically with a single track, always use the other track to help out. Just give it a little bit more power, and that extra power will help the tank be able to overcome said driving conditions. This isn't necessarily true just for this Mato model or even a Taigen, but also even a 1/6 scale Armortech or even a real bulldozer or tank for that matter. Whenever you notice something like that happening, always give the help from the other track, as it will help you out trying to overcome said obstacles. As for final thoughts on this model, this one here was indeed a challenge in order to get it from its starting point all the way up to the completed state that you see here in this video, for both several factors. First, many of the stock components need to have been replaced in order just to get the model to function properly, as well as also there were some supply line hiccups with that from getting the parts from overseas. With all that aside, probably the biggest hindrance that this model had to do with the base media that the model was made in. Unlike the plastic Henlong or Taigen offerings on the market, because the entire tank is made out of that die-cast metal alloy, this did create some sort of a challenge in order to rework the model in order to get it up to the state that you see it in this video. Such features like deletion of the tools or even that extra antenna spot, which is always found on this side here of the model on these 1/16s, on the plastic tanks would be removed in a fairly simplistic and quick manner, and with a Dremel does make short work of it. On this metal one here, this did prolong the procedures, as working with this metal is not nearly as simple as working with the plastic. This also in turn puts a lot more wear and tear on your power tools in order to achieve the same result. However, even though this does require more patience and more tooling time to perform the procedures, the same procedures can still be done nonetheless. As for a skill level and a recommendation, I definitely recommend this tank for anyone who's an avid fan of 1/16 RC tanks. For anyone who has several Henlongs or a Tamiya or even a few Taigens in their collection, something like this will definitely be a nice addition to that type of a collection. However, keep in mind, because of the problems that I encountered with the radio equipment, I really can't recommend this build for someone who is a ready-to-run RC tank fan. Something like this is definitely meant for someone that likes to pop the hood and get into the inner workings and change out the mechanics. It's not impossible, but is something that needs to be addressed. Now, again, I can't really say for Mato tanks in general, as there are several Mato tank kits on the market that do look very nice, and the price range on these are fairly affordable. The electronics on this one were definitely a downside, and like I said before, was some of the worst I've ever seen in a 1/16 scale RTR model. As for the newer models, perhaps they've changed this. If anyone does have this info, feel free to mention in the comments section below, as I would be interested to know that. However, back to the topic, this model here again is definitely recommended for someone that again likes to pop the hood and get into the inner workings. This model here is a nice intermediary for someone who wants to get into the metal RC tank hobby, however, doesn't want to splurge at the moment just yet on something like an Armortech. This model here scratches that large all-metal RC tank feel without the price shock of something like an Armortech 1/6 scale radio control tank kit. This model here would also be recommended for anyone who is an avid fan, of course, of World War II German armor or the Tiger I family in general, as you cannot have a World War II collection without a German Tiger I. Now, with this variant of the Tiger I being an early production Tiger, you are going to be somewhat limited in the type and scope and range of Tiger Is that you can model. However, with the sheer variety of aftermarket parts on the market that are both in plastic and as well as in metal, you can either take the model from this point here, backdate it to something more of an initial production period or a DAK, or you can take it and propel it further in time and make it possibly that of a mid-production unit. All of these types of vehicles can be modified and built from this base platform. So for anyone who wants to look into that, something like this might also be a viable option. Because this model here does feature basically the same construction style as the Taigen and the Henlongs on the market, most of those components are compatible with the Mato kit. And with that, that wraps up this model showcase video for this radio-controlled 1/16 scale early production German Tiger I. If you like this video, stop by and like us on Facebook, where there are more photographs of this particular build that have been posted, as well as the other smaller and larger scale builds that have been showcased on the ECA channel. Furthermore, don't forget to swing by eastcoastarmory.com, where there are more builds as well as detail components in both 1/6 and 1/16 scale. Thanks for watching.